Obviously, a very powerful clip, very powerful piece of film. Let's start with the way we've started every night, and I want to go to Dr. Fuller because obviously there is much to be said about the accuracy from a medical perspective. Dr. Fuller, can you talk a little bit about? I know you've got a lot to say tonight, and can you hit some of the high points on what we've just seen and how much of that is accurate, how much of it is artistic?
But what we've just seen, I believe, is kind of a mixture of some historical accuracy, medical accuracy, along with a lot of Christian imagery that's kind of mixed in there for theatrical effects. First of all, let me describe to you the historical process of crucifixion, and then we'll kind of get into some of the medical aspects of that. Crucifixion was initially invented not by the Romans, but by the Persians. And then it was kind of passed along to the Egyptians and to the Carthaginians. And it's probably from the Carthaginians that Romans adopted it as a form of torture and execution. But the Romans can be credited with perfecting it. Now, initially, the Persians, what they would do is they would take a single post and they would affix the person to the post either through impaling them on the post or tying them to the post. But the whole point was to get their feet off the ground because they did not want their feet touching holy ground. They didn't want this unholy person to be even touching the ground that they were being crucified on. When we see the imagery of Jesus carrying the cross, what we notice is that he's carrying this huge cross through the streets on his way to Golgotha in the movie. And what he's carrying is more of a Latin-type cross. It looks kind of like a lowercase t. And from what we know of the historical accuracy of the way crucifixions were done, there are different types of crosses were used. There was a Latin cross like the one Jesus was carrying there in the movie. There was also a towel-shaped cross that looked like a capital T, but was actually much shorter than the Latin cross. There was an X-shaped cross that literally looked just like an X. There was one that basically just resembled a tree or was a tree that you could be nailed upon. There could be a single post, and there could be variations of all these as far as the sizes and the heights of the cross. The overall weight of the entire cross would weigh probably in excess of 300 pounds. So if you can imagine trying to lug 300 pounds, and the distance that he had to traverse was probably close to a third of a mile, somewhere around 600 to 630 yards. This would be a superhuman feat for anybody in excellent physical condition to do. So, what usually happened, at least historically from the way the Romans traditionally did it at the time of Christ in that specific region, was there was a two-section cross. There was a part called the stipes, which was a permanently affixed post in the ground that stayed at the site of crucifixion. And then there was a separate cross piece called the patabulum. The patabulum weighed somewhere between 75 and 125 pounds. And it was basically balanced across the neck of the victim, and then a lot of times it was lashed across their shoulders with ropes. And then they would carry this patabulum from the site of their scourging to the site of their execution, where they would actually be nailed to the cross. While they were traversing this distance, they would be accompanied by a squad of Roman soldiers. They would be headed up by a centurion. There would be a placard called the titulus that would be represented, that would display the crimes of that individual as he walked towards the place of his execution. And then when he arrived at his destination, they would affix him permanently to that patibulum. And the way they would do that was either through tying his hands to it, or the Romans preferred nailing. Now, we know from examining ossuaries are grave sites that are around Jerusalem from dating around the time of Christ, that they've actually found a grave, an ossuary that contained a crucified body. And we know that, at least in this instance, that the nails were driven through the wrist and not the palms of the hands. We also know from the Shroud of Turin, it also suggests that the side of nailing was through the wrist and not through the palms of the hands. And medical literature from the 1950s and 1970s would support that it is more likely to support the weight of a human body when the nail is driven in the wrist rather than being driven through the hands. And the reason is quite simple. If you drive the nail through the palm of the hand, basically as the weight is distributed on that hand, the nail can rip right through and you can fall off. And that's not something they wanted to have done. Sometimes these crucifixions lasted for days, and they wanted them to be permanently affixed to this patibulum. So what they would do is they would drive the nail just proximal to the carpal bones in the wrist, or sometimes between the carpal bones of the wrist. And this was actually still considered part of the hands by the ancients of those days. Now, in doing so, this would transect or damage the median nerve, which goes right through the center of the wrist. It would possibly damage ligaments in the wrist. It would cause a lot of periosteal bruising. It would also probably damage a lot of the tendons that run through this area that control your fingers. And it would probably also put pressure upon your median, upon your ulnar nerve and your radial nerve as well. So you can imagine what it would do basically is it would result in a kind of a contractured claw-like grasp with a lot of very severe shooting pain. It would be like shock-like waves of pain that would be traveling up your arm basically the entire period of time. And any pressure that you put on your wrist would worsen that.